All right, today we're going to be covering a group of empires that are usually referred to as either gunpowder empires or land-based empires. And they're special because they occurred during a time period when empires actually had access to, no surprises here, gunpowder. And that's going to make them a little bit different than empires that we've seen in the past. They're going to be in some cases a little bit larger than empires that we had seen in the past. Gunpowder helps these groups control more areas, and we're also going to see the disappearance, really, of the Central Asian nomad as a threat to settled empires, and that's a really key point that we'll come back to later in this PowerPoint. So, if you would, please make sure not only that you've got this lecture down pat, make sure that you pay attention while you're reading. I know it's a tendency among a lot of students to kind of skim and look for the specific answers, but what I'm doing in your reading questions is having you guys read sections, and then my questions are really summaries of that section. So it really helps you have some better answers if you've read the whole section and really thought about what the point of the question is. So take a look really quickly at the map up here. I need you to kind of know where you are oriented in space. Right here you can see the boot of Italy, Eastern Europe, that's modern day Turkey, parts of the modern day Middle East, and North Africa. All of those areas were held by the Ottoman Empire. Most of those areas actually were also held by Rome. Okay, so it's almost that same kind of Mediterranean empire that we saw in the Roman period, although significantly larger. The small states of Europe that are sort of coalescing under absolute monarchs are over here. We talked about Italy during the Renaissance, so that's sort of contemporary with the events that we'll be talking about today. In the middle, we have an empire called the Safavid Empire. It's based in historic Persia. We, way back in time period 2, looked at the first of quite a few Persian empires, and the Safavid is sort of a new iteration of that, although this time around, because of the advent of Islam, the Persian Safavid Empire is going to be Muslim rather than Zoroastrian, which it was sort of the last time that we studied empires that sprang up out of that area. Over on the right, you see the Mughal Empire. That is throughout modern-day northern India, but it also covers a decent part of like modern-day Afghanistan, some areas that are kind of in Central Asia. Modern-day Pakistan was a part of that. So the Mughals are also going to be an Islamic empire, although hopefully we know by now that the majority of India's population is always going to be Hindu. So that's going to have sort of a special I don't know, characteristic, I guess, in that the Mughals are going to always be Muslim rulers who have as their subjects mostly Hindus, so it sort of makes them a little bit different. The Safavid Empire is going to be a little bit special because they are going to follow a unique type of Islam called Twelver Shiism. And hopefully you guys remember the difference between Shiites and Sunnis. Originally, the split was over who should take leadership within the Muslim community after the death of Muhammad. The Ottoman Empire is primarily going to be Sunni Muslim, and oftentimes the Safavid and the Ottoman Empire are going to be at odds with each other and often at war over territory and power issues, but also over that religious difference, similarly to how Europe fought between Roman Catholics and Protestants in wars like the 30 Years' War that were occurring at the same time that the wars between, for example, the Safavids and Ottomans were going down. So make sure that you've got your guided notes out, and we'll go ahead and get started. So the College Board defines for you guys a few examples of what they define as land-based gunpowder empires. And again, these are empires that are obviously well, we'll talk about what land-based really means. I mean, it sounds obvious, but we'll talk a little bit more about it just to make sure we're all clear. But again, these are empires that are created after the advent of gunpowder. They are different and special for that reason. Gunpowder gives central governments a new and greater form of controlling their population. A gunpowder army is going to be a lot better tool of centralization than traditional infantries or cavalries that are based on archery or anything like that. So I'd like you to jot just out to the side where it says land-based gunpowder empires. I'd like you to jot out to the side that where it says gunpowder empires, just jot out to the side that gunpowder is a tool for increased centralization. A tool for increased centralization. I hope it is obvious to you why guns might help a government centralize power. So it is a tool for centralization. So again, think back to that map we just looked at. The Ottoman Empire is based in Anatolia, that's modern day Turkey, North Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Again, that's just what we looked at. The Safavids in modern day Iran, which usually historically is called Persia, and Central Asia, and the Mughals in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the northern portion of modern day India. Not within this lecture, but within the idea of land-based gunpowder empires, next week and the week after, we'll be looking at Qing Dynasty China, the Russian Empire, which we've actually already covered quite a bit with their extension into Siberia through the Cossacks and to gain fur, and then Tokugawa Japan, which we have not yet covered at all, but that again comes next week. So in general, and I want you to think mostly as we talk through this lecture, I want you to think mostly about those first three, the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughals, the Muslim gunpowder empires. That's what we're going to be looking at in this lecture primarily. Okay, but the most important thing about land-based empires is, of course, that they're based on land. But what this means more specifically is that these empires spread out into contiguous or adjacent territory from a home base. This is very dissimilar from some of the unique and new empires that we've been looking at throughout time period 4. We've, for example, looked at Spain, which created a very far-flung empire based in the Americas. We've looked at Portugal, which created a trading post empire around the coast of Africa, around the coast of India, and around the coast of Southeast Asia. We've looked at the Netherlands. If you'll recall, they had trading posts in the southern part of Africa and also over in Southeast Asia. If you'll recall in class, we looked at that article about nutmeg and how the Netherlands, through the VOC, the United Dutch East India Company, began to take over those spice islands. So that sets up a really nice comparison according to the College Board. You've got on the one hand Europe, which really is kind of hemmed in at home. They don't have the ability to expand at home. No one in Europe is successful at creating one big fat European empire. What you get in Europe, as we've talked about, are a bunch of tiny little feuding nation states, like England, France, Portugal, Spain. So you get these small states, and of course they fight one another often, but no one is able to, like France never goes and conquers Spain. France never goes and conquers the Holy Roman Empire. No one ever consolidates all of that territory and makes it one big fat landmass that's all united. So instead, because they're unable to do that, instead what Europe does is sort of make the leap, and they create these trading post empires. That's very different from what we're going to look at today, which is a group, for example, the Safavids, who have a home base in Persia and kind of spread out from there to contiguous adjacent territories. So all of these land-based empires are going to have a great reliance on their infantry. Remember, infantry are foot soldiers. If you would, out to the side of that word infantry, I know a lot of you know it by now, but please just go ahead and write foot soldiers. I want to make sure that everybody has that definition down pat. So reliance on infantry, foot soldiers. This is very different. Take a big guess in your mind. A sea-based trading post empire. Are they going to rely on infantry troops, ground troops, foot soldiers? Nope, they're probably going to rely on, you might have guessed it, a navy with a lot of boats, okay? Because they've got to be able to get to their far-flung empires. So that's a really big difference between the two. Land-based gunpowder empires are also going to have a big reliance on what are called land-grant military systems. And I want you to write what this is out to the side. I want you to just note, kind of as it sounds, that soldiers were paid in land. Soldiers were paid in land. This would usually encompass an estate with people on an estate to work that land for you. It's interesting though. You might be able to sort of surmise this, but if you were a land grant military system and you pay your soldiers using lands, you have a really constant pressure to continually expand, because how are you going to pay your new soldiers? Well, you've got to go out and you have to conquer new land. So that's going to create this like catch-22, because you have to have land to pay your military, but if you get too big, it's going to be difficult to hold an empire together. And we'll see that that becomes a huge problem for these empires and ultimately will help to lead to their decline. They'll also have a huge cost associated with their militaries, and because of their large militaries and their large land masses, they're going to work hard to try to centralize. And we will see new methods of centralization in all of these empires. However, ultimately, because of a lack of modern technology, really, they're unable to really pull it together. And of course, once they get too big, they have the same problems that all empires get when they get too big. It's difficult to keep everything pulled together toward that center. We've got a few other characteristics. And this is an important one. I want you to put a star beside it. The Islamic gunpowder empires, every single one of them, the Safavid, Ottoman, and Mughal, all trace their heritage, the heritage of their ruling class, back to nomadic Central Asian roots. What that means is they come from the same place, sort of geographically and culturally speaking, that the Mongols came from. If you guys will recall, in the 12 and 1300s, the Mongols created a huge, largest ever land-based empire. And they incorporated a huge number of people into it through some really interesting military tactics. And often what happened when the Mongols conquered areas is that they kind of assimilated into the population. And you can think of other Central Asians in a very similar way. The Central Asians who burst onto the scene in the time period we're talking about right now and created these big empires, they used those same tactics at first to conquer the territories that they eventually created their empires out of. They were cavalry based. And I know I just said that they were based on foot soldiers, and they were, but that was later. When they were first being created, they were very much in that Central Asian mold, which is to have a bunch of soldiers on horseback, a bunch of cavalry shooting arrows, a bunch of archers. So all of those gunpowder empires pretty much started in that way. They had that as their background, specifically Turkic. And I'd like you all to write out to the side of that bullet point. I know you've already started. I'd like you to just write the word Turkic out to the side. Turkic is spelled Turkic. And I know we think of Turkey as being Turkic, but Turkey takes its name from the Ottomans, the Turks who settled there and founded their empire there. Originally, Turkic groups are from Central Asia, and you can see that in names of modern nations like Turkmenistan, which is located in Central Asia. These empires are also traditional in the sense that they share a lot of traits that we've seen throughout history up to this point for empires. They're going to use similar methods of centralization, similar methods of rule, similar economic styles. They will, of course, have innovations, but they're going to be similar to what we've seen in the past. In addition, and this is an important point as well, so I'd like you to star it, especially in the case of the Ottoman Empire, their armies are often made up of slave soldiers. And I said here rather than the European feudal model. So let's talk about what that means briefly. In a lot of empires, what happened was there is a king, and there are sort of warrior elites underneath of that king. So people who have a lot of money and a lot of soldiers, and they might give allegiance to one ruler who they call the king. But in reality, in that system, in that kind of system where you have your military sort of tied up in your warrior elite, what you've got really is a centralized ruler that has a really difficult time centralizing power. Because when they want a big military to fight a war, what they have to do is ask all of the elites within their kingdom, all those warriors, if they would be willing to fight. And a lot of times those people aren't willing. In other cases, a lot of those warrior elites will take their military and actually fight against the king to try to make themselves rulers. So you got a lot of instability in this system. And what they do instead in these Islamic gunpowder empires is create militaries made up of slaves. And I know that sounds like it would be difficult to gain loyalty of slave soldiers. However, slave soldiers usually had a fairly privileged life. And in the Ottoman Empire, at any rate, a lot of the slave soldiers, which were called janissaries, you'll see that in the book, usually rose up in power. And usually the Grand Vizier, who's the main advisor to the king, usually that Grand Vizier was actually a slave soldier themselves. So that position, although you were a slave, came with a lot of power and prestige within the empire. All right. These empires, by and large, are also known for some really awesome culture. The Muslim world, as it was the last time we looked at it in time period 3, was very advanced culturally, economically, and technologically. They had huge cities. They had scholars everywhere. Hopefully you guys remember the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. So that's that kind of cultural and intellectual background is definitely still present in these new versions of the Islamic empires that appear in this time period 4. So I want you to, whenever you think of these gunpowder empires, I want you to remember that although they're militarily very adept, they're also culturally experiencing a lot of growth and creativity. We have a few rulers that you need to know. So I want you to put a couple of underlines or a big star or a llama beside that third bullet point. We need to know the Golden Age ruler of each of these empires. There's Suleiman the Magnificent. He's actually called Suleiman the Magnificent by Europeans. His name in his own empire, in the Ottoman Empire, was Suleiman the Lawgiver. He reorganized the laws of the Ottoman Empire and made them more coherent, kind of like Justinian did. I don't know if you guys remember that from the Byzantine Empire. He was also called the Lawgiver. So Suleiman, he wore an enormous turban. I'm trying to remember if there's a picture of him in your book. I'm flipping through it, but I don't see it. Anyway, look him up online. He's got an enormous turban. I don't know how he managed to hold it up with his neck. Abbas the Great is the Golden Age ruler of the Safavid Empire, and Akbar is a very important ruler. I've seen him by name on the actual AP test. He ruled the Mughal Empire at its height. Coffee. I know we talked a little bit about this in the Europe portion. You guys read a whole section of your summer reading about coffee and its role. But coffee houses were a hugely important cultural location in these large Islamic gunpowder empires. It was a place where cultural things happened and intellectual life took place, similar to the way they are today. I wanted to show you a couple pictures really quickly. Suleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, which before that had been called Constantinople. You'll read about the conquest of Constantinople in 1453 in your chapter 19 reading. This is the Shah Mosque. I think it's called Imam Mosque now. It's had a name change since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. But these blue tiles, this really nice cobalt blue, is actually called Isfahan blue because the Safavid Empire sort of where that really dark, rich blue originates. And these aren't tall. The mosques in the Safavid Empire weren't so much tall as just really impressive, decoratively speaking. And of course, you can see that on the outside of this mosque right here. The Safavid Empire is also the home of what we call usually Persian rugs or Oriental rugs. So I threw a couple of those on there. But again, I want you to think about these empires and understand the kind of cultural creativity that was occurring within them. And of course, this very, very famous monument. And I don't think I have anything in your notes about this, but I'd like you to maybe jot it out to the side somewhere where it says the Mughals. Just note that the Taj Mahal is built by the Mughals. And it's actually a mausoleum. You might not know what a mausoleum is, but it's a place to hold a dead body. So Shah Jahan had a wife that he loved, and she died, and he was sad. So he built this huge building to be her resting place. And he originally wanted, you see there's like this reflecting pool right here. He originally wanted to build himself across the way from the reflecting pool his own sort of large mausoleum. However, he never got the chance. He was overthrown by his son. I think his son is Aurangzeb. I think that's right. Anyway, he's overthrown by his son, a younger son. And the younger son who overthrew the dad also went to war with his own older brother to make sure that he could take the throne. And he ends up cutting off the head of his older brother and sending it to Shah Jahan, his dad, who was in prison by that point. So it's a super lovely little family story. So anytime you think like your family's awkward at Christmas, just remember the story of the Mughal Empire's dynasty. All right, common problems other than, chopping off your brother's head. First of all, they're too big. They had transportation and communication issues. Gunpowder, again, is a tool of centralization. That means that you can grow your empire. But the problem is you don't have like internet or interstate highways or the combustion engine. So you can't really get around and you can't really communicate with your empire that's now enormous. So that becomes a really big problem. They also have that nomadic heritage. Remember that they were originally Turkic nomads. They converted to Islam and they began to create their empires and settle down. But they never really lost, the elites within their population never really lost that sort of warrior background, and that's going to cause a big problem. You see them attempt to solve that problem with their slave infantry armies, but the warrior elite is never really going to fully acquiesce to having a centralized government that takes away some of their power. They also have European rivals that are on the rise. And we've talked about this in class already, but Europe was full of tiny, small states. There was a ton of competition between them, and that made technology, specifically weapon technology, develop really rapidly. We, in class, talked about how cannon and artillery were really developed in Europe. The other problem with this was not just that their weaponry was falling behind, but also the trade routes were moving to those ocean routes that Europeans didn't really, I say control here, but they're not really gonna, they move the goods through that system. So that's a bit of a problem because the land routes, like the Silk Roads that we've been talking about for so long, begin a period of decline because it's easier to move goods by water. So if Europe is sort of presenting this better option of moving goods via water in the Atlantic system or through the Indian Ocean like the Portuguese and Dutch did, then trade is going to move toward that easier option rather than going across land. There's also this long-term change that I alluded to at the beginning. The Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires come from Turkic nomadic roots, but ironically, that long threat that had always come from Central Asian nomads ends with the advent of gunpowder. It doesn't matter how scary your army is on horseback. If you face down an army that doesn't have gunpowder with an army that does utilize gunpowder, pretty much you're going to get beaten by the gunpowder military. And that's what happens across Central Asia. The primary drivers of this are Russia and the Qing dynasty, but it also happens, especially with the Safavids and the Mughals as they move up into Central Asia from their own territories. So this isn't really a discussion. I'd just like you to jot down a few answers on your own paper. So take a moment and pause as you need to, but I've got a quote there. It says, of the previous sultan, the sultan is the ruler of the Ottoman Empire. Of the previous sultans or rulers, there were many who ruled the land, but few who ruled the sea. In the conduct of war at sea, the infidels here in this quote refers to Christians, Europeans. So the Europeans are superior to us. We must overcome them. And this is a quote from the Grand Vizier, or the main advisor of Suleiman the Magnificent, the guy we've already talked about from the Ottoman Empire. So the question is, why do you think that traditional land-based empires didn't really meet that challenge of changing the basis of their power to sea-based militaries? And eventually this is going to cause them to be eclipsed by European powers. So take a minute and pause and just think about history and the position of these empires in the 14 and 1500s. Why didn't they go out and make big navies? So take a few minutes and answer that question. I'm going to ask you your answers tomorrow in class, so make sure that you've got something decent down there. And, pause as you need to. Okay, the second question asks you to just create a T-chart with the headings land powers on one side and sea powers on the other. I want you to list at least 6 qualities of each type of power underneath. You'll need to be a little bit creative for this and think way back to what we did before the break. I'll get it started for you. So on the land power side of my chart, I would probably write something like utilizes infantry. And on the sea-based power, I would probably write utilizes strong navies. I might say something about the land itself. So under land powers, I might say something like conquered adjacent territories. And under sea powers, I might list something like created trading post empires across wide swaths of land. I don't know. You might want to shorten that a little bit. So pause as needed. Come up with 4 more on your own. And the last question, why do you think long term that sea power was more effective than land-based empires? This is a really interesting question, and it gets to the heart of what we'll be speaking about in really time period 5. But European sea-based powers are going to sort of become the new major powers in the globe. Why do you think that having a big navy and being a sea-based power long-term is something that gains you more power than having a big infantry or land-based empire? So take a minute to answer that. We'll be talking about those questions at the beginning of class tomorrow, and that's it for your lecture today.